Right then, year 10, the first thing I would like to do is write the numbers 1 to 6 down the side of your page and have a go at the recap questions, which I'm going to read out in a minute. After I've done that, I'd like to then get a green pen, and on the next slide the answers are going to come up, and I would like you to mark those with your green pen. So number 1, who were Elizabeth's chief counsellors? And by that I don't mean the names of the individuals, I mean what group of people were Elizabeth's chief counsellors. Number 2, who was Elizabeth's Secretary of State? And by that I mean her first one, the most important one. Number 3, what relation was Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots? So how were they related? Number 4, who was the head of the Catholic Church? Number 5, who were the Puritans? And number 6, what was the Act of Uniformity? So for the answers now, as you can see, for number 1, who were Elizabeth's chief counsellors, the answer is the Privy Council. And to remember that, you just have to think of the Prime Minister's cabinet today. They're like the advisors, the helpers that help the Queen. Number 2, who was Elizabeth's first Secretary of State? It was William Cecil, which, as you should know from that documentary, is the guy that runs this massive spy network that protects Elizabeth throughout all the assassination attempts. Number 3, what relation was Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots? Mary was Elizabeth's cousin. Number 4, it was the Pope who was head of the Catholic Church. Number 5, who were the Puritans? They are a group of radical Protestants. Remember, they want things to be more Protestant than what Elizabeth is making them. They also want to completely get rid of the Catholics from England. And number 6, what was the Act of Uniformity? It was this act that made sure all churches looked the same, all religious services were the same. So if you imagine going to church on a Sunday, every service was roughly similar. It was all Protestant. So once you've marked those, I would like to move on to the next slide, and under your recap quiz, I would like you to write today's date and title, in addition to your keywords. Now, I've put a little notice there, attention, because this lesson is going to be based around the textbook which I have emailed out to you earlier last week. Now, I should hope you all know what the keywords are. So education is what you're doing now, it's learning new things. Schools, obviously a place of education, and universities, a place of higher education, where people get things like degrees and do subjects in more depth. So what we're going to do now, after you've written your date and your title, is we're going to use the next few slides to make a few notes on what education was like during the time of Elizabeth I. So like this slide says, we're going to look at the next 3 slides, and I'll need you to make some detailed notes because it's important that you have these for your revision when it comes round to it. So at the top of each slide, you're going to see a subheading, which I would like you to write neatly and underline. Now, under these subheadings, as I talk you through it, I would like you to make your own detailed notes. The really important bits are the bits in blue, but that does not mean you should just write down the blue bits. Okay, write down a bit extra so you understand what the blue bits are saying. I should say while we do this, if I am talking too quickly, feel free to pause this video so you have time to take the notes down yourself, okay? So we're going to start with attitudes of education during the Elizabethan time. Now at this time, it might surprise some of you, or some of you might enjoy this idea, but there was no formal system of schooling, which means children did not have to go to school. Unlike today, where children do have to go to school by law. However, education was starting to become more important to Elizabethans. They thought it was important that their children understood how to behave, how to sort of represent what they thought was a good person. So, Elizabethan England, or England in general at this time, even though it did not have an enforced formal system of education, it did have a very strict social structure. And by that I mean it had a certain way of doing things which it didn't want to change from. And for example, the best example I can think about that is things like a class system where you had normal workers at the bottom, you had kind of like middle class, so like people that did things like teachers and stuff like that, people that had been trained, and then you had the upper class, which is the nobility and the Queen herself. Now, if you lived during Elizabethan England, the education you received at the time was pretty much based on the life you were expected to lead. So, for example, those people born to working families and poor families were expected to lead a certain life and stay poor or stay as working people, which meant your education was expected to go a certain way. Similarly, if you think about the nobility, their education was expected to go a very different way to that of poor working people, just because of who they are and where they were born. Additionally, it was very different between boys and girls. Now, at the time, very few boys went to school, but even fewer girls went to school because it wasn't seen as important to educate girls during this time, because it was the boy that would carry on the father's work and inherit all of the father's land and title and possessions. Now, this introduction of education that we're going to start to see during the Elizabethan period came along with this idea of humanism, which I have briefly mentioned before. Mentioned it right back at the start of studying the Elizabethan module, and also even further back when we were doing about medicine during the Renaissance. And humanism basically is this idea that you should learn about the person, the human body, what it means to be an English person, things like that, putting the person first rather than religion. And it is this belief that people believe would stop the people depending on superstitious ideas. So, for example, we've already studied medicine, so it's not too relevant to this, but you can draw a comparison. Education is what stopped people being superstitious and believing in things like ghosts and witches, and it is that hope that through educating, people will move away from superstitions and the supernatural beliefs towards more rational ideas that we have today. Now, what happened was society did start to change. I mentioned it as quite a rigid structure, but the thing is that even though it was rigid, it did move about a bit. And Protestants rejected the idea that only Catholic priests should be able to read. Now, before this time, it was only Catholic priests that could read and was allowed to read the Bible. And Protestants said everybody should be able to read. Now, the key part of that is making sure the Bible was not written in Latin, because Protestants wanted it to be written in English, which is quite different to what has come hundreds of years before that. It led to an increase in the amount of people who became what we call literate. And now the word literate means being able to read, to write, and to speak fluently. And as this happened, towns and cities started to develop a bit more because they could communicate better. It led to more specialised jobs, which in turn led to a better education in towns and cities. So it's like a cycle going all the way around, with people starting to read, people getting better and more educated, towns improving, which led to more education, people getting more, getting smarter and things like that. And a gradual thing of it keeps happening all the way through. However, it is important to remember that education was still limited. This is because of that strict hierarchy I mentioned earlier, the fact that working class families tended to stay working class, middle class families stayed middle class, and the upper class, the nobility, was very strict on who they allowed to join their ranks because they didn't want anyone else. They thought they were a separate bunch, they were above everybody else. Now, rural areas is where farming remained primarily the way of life, and by that I mean the farmers received probably the least amount of education, because all they were required to have by Elizabethan social standards was the knowledge on how to farm. According to other people, it didn't matter that they didn't know how to read or write, as long as they knew how to farm. And with this, cities became more educated. However, rural areas, so farms and the countryside, they became less educated, and you started to see a big gap widening between the two. So what you should have now is you should have three separate headings. You should have one saying attitudes to education, another one about the influences of humanism, and another one about education and societal change, the way society has changed between towns and cities. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at this in a bit more depth and divide up those three areas we've looked at into six key areas, which I'm going to give you the notes on, and all I would like you to do is to answer a couple of questions next to each one as I read it out. So as you can see here, I have given you this sheet. Now you'll find this sheet Now, if we look at the first one, the nobility, I'm going to read it out and I would like you to try and answer the questions, and I'll try and explain in a bit more depth to help you out. So, for example, the children of the nobility learn lots of different subjects. These were Latin, Greek, history, philosophy, theology, which is RE. As Elizabeth herself was highly educated in these subjects, nobles wanted their children to follow Elizabeth's example, so she was seen as a role model for all children, not just girls. However, girls of the nobility also learned to dance, ride a horse, and be good at archery. Boys of the nobility were also taught to ride horses and archery, which is shooting bows and arrows, but they were also taught things like fencing, swimming, and other sports only men could do at the time. The eldest son would inherit their father's title when he died, so to learn how to become a good nobleman, he would be sent to a fellow noble household to finish his education. Girls would also be sent to other noble families. Their goal would be to make useful social contacts. Boys and girls were educated separately from the age of 7, but in the same household. So if you think about why did children of the nobility learn different subjects, it's because, as we said, the nobility wanted their children to represent Elizabeth or to represent the monarch in general, because the monarch was held up as this sort of role model for young people. They were chosen by God. They were the greatest person in the land. The nobility wanted their children to represent this person, this God's voice on earth, as they thought. So why did the children of nobility learn different subjects? It's so they can represent Elizabeth. They can take after Elizabeth and the monarch. Now, explain positive aspects of the nobility's education. What you have to think about there is they're doing lots of different subjects. So both boys and girls are doing a range of subjects. Doing it to take after Elizabeth, but they're getting lots of exercise, doing sports and things like that. So, for example, boys and girls both learn to horse ride. They both learn archery, and it's pretty active, pretty varied. However, the bad part is that it's very divided between the two. So you've got boys learning things like fencing and swimming, stereotypically quite male activities, and when we come to leisure later, you're going to see that a bit more. And girls learning pretty much how to be, nobility girls anyway at this time, learning pretty much how to be a lady and basically how to be a good wife and a good mother. Now, merchants and craftsmen went to something called grammar schools, and they ran a bit differently depending on classes, the sons of merchants and craftsmen. These classes focused on more practical subjects such as English, maths, geography and manual skills. These types of lessons made boys ready for work and the jobs that are available. Boys would be best prepared for the life that they were expected to lead, not the life that they may have wanted to lead. So, for example, if you were the son of a merchant, who is someone who sells something, or a craftsman, someone who makes something, you were very much directed into going down the same path that your dad did, no matter what. So if you had an interest in, for example, performing on stage, or being a knight, or being a warrior, a soldier, you didn't really get the chance to do that because you were pushed down into the same job that your dad did. Which meant if your dad, for example, was involved in making clothes, so a tailor or something like that, then you were pushed into doing the same kind of thing. The key point here, is that there is no mention of girls in this. This is a male trade. The boys had to do what their dad did. So what is different? What was different about merchants and nobility? It's that the nobility were educated in order to inherit, so get everything their dad owned once their dad died, whereas merchants are educated to take over from their dad on their job. Now, the positive and negative aspects of a merchant's education is you are certainly trained to do one job. So it's like an apprenticeship that you might do after school. You're trained and you're pretty much guaranteed a job at the end of it. The problem is there is very little choice on what job you can do. You pretty much have to do the job that your dad did. And unfortunately, it is a very male-dominated area, which means the girls of any family were not allowed this kind of education. So the next form of education is something called petty schools, and petty schools were run and set up at a teacher's home, which personally, although you lot are great, I would hate to do. Petty schools acted similar to primary schools, and boys would be sent here where they would learn things like reading and writing and basic maths. However, punishments here were quite harsh, and pupils often got beaten for poor behaviour and simply not doing well in lessons. So like now, if you don't understand something, I'm not allowed to beat you. However, I will try and help you. Back during the Elizabethan time, the teacher would not hesitate to get a cane and to hit a student over the knuckles. Girls would go to the dame school, and this is the same as a petty school. However, it's more geared towards just girl education. Now here, like in primary school that we have today, you've got SATs. They would do some kind of test at the end of these schools, particular petty schools, and the brighter boys that went to these petty schools would often go to what's called a grammar school, which is sort of like a high-class school. We used to have them not so long ago now, before comprehensives and academies came in. And they're like this top school that you go to after you've done certain tests. Now these petty schools, like we said, catered to just boys, and girls went to something called a dame school. Okay? And these were primarily for the purpose of students who weren't necessarily going down the craftsman route or the merchant route, and who weren't part of the nobility. Now, explaining positive and negative aspects of this education, both boys and girls did get some basic education in learning how to read, write and do basic maths. However, it is still pretty much gendered, and boys and girls were separate. There is also no guarantee of a job at the end of this. Now, if we move on to things like labourers and poor children, so a labourer is someone who just does manual labour for their job. So it might be lots of heavy lifting, hard work, working with your hands, things like that. Just basically hard graft. Most Elizabethans had little or no proper schooling. As the majority of the population were poor, many could not afford to go to school. So you had to pay for school during this time. They learned what they needed to from their families working on the farm or in the house. Many families needed the children to work, otherwise they could not afford to feed them. Most jobs did not require literacy or numeracy, so work was easy to find. Your education was based on your social order, and you would be expected to fit into the system. So basically, poor children during this time didn't get any education at all. It wasn't seen as important to have strong literacy or numeracy skills. It wasn't seen as important to be able to read or to write or to communicate fluently. So long as they could work with their hands and do the hard graft that their parents did, they were fine. Now, I've put there, was this fair at the time? And the question basically is no. Nowadays, we would look at this as not being fair at all, because they are missing out on so many chances that they would have in life. However, back then, it was the social order, the hierarchy of people. So the working class, the labourers and the poor children were at the very bottom of society. So, middle classes and grammar schools. There were a huge development of grammar schools in the 1560s and 1570s. Over 72 were opened during this period. This meant there were more schools than ever before in Elizabethan England. Before this, only the church had provided a minimum education to children, so it was very much a religious education. Grammar schools were set up for wealthy middle-class children who were considered intelligent. The sons of businessmen, lawyers and doctors, in particular, went to these middle-class grammar schools. Grammar schools charged fees to go there and were based on how much the family owned. Some lower-class boys could also go for free if they showed that they were intelligent enough. And the school day would start at 7 a.m. in the morning and not finish till 5 p.m. In the afternoon. So you're talking 10 hours there of solid school, which if you think about it now, you only have roughly 6 hours. So who were grammar schools set up for? It is basically the middle classes, the slightly more wealthy people who can afford to send their children to school. With this, also exceptionally bright students who proved themselves as well at petty schools would also get to go here. Now the positives and negatives of this is that it does provide a high level of education for a growing number of people, a growing number of students, particularly boys. The bad part about this is you have to pay for it. So the poorer areas of society are left out, and again, it is still rather gendered. There weren't as many girls that went to places like this. Now there were also schools for skilled craftsmen, and these were grammar schools available for sons of craftsmen and farmers. Most of the educators would come in the form of an apprenticeship where they would learn what was necessary to run the family business or farm. Boys would be allowed to go to school if the family did not need them to help run the business or the farm. Schooling was not compulsory, so you did not have to go, and it was left to the parents to decide if their son should attend or work on the farm. Even if the boys did go to school, many had to leave early to work for the family business, so they missed some education. So, with the answer to what different types of education were there was education for the nobility, education for the middle classes, and education for the labouring and the poor working classes. Now, it was almost compulsory for the nobility to go to their form of education. The middle classes had to pay for it, but it was considered necessary. And for skilled craftsmen and the poor, it was important. However, work at home often came first because they needed their children to make enough money to survive. So there you've got the 6 main types of education in Elizabethan England. Now, if I went through that too quickly, you can pause this video to go through it at your own pace, and I will keep replaying it to catch up. You also don't have to use this video if it is too distracting. Just go through the slides on your own. So what we're going to do now is we'll look at the impact of education on Elizabethan England. So what I'd like to do now, under your page, could you please write the words, what impact did schools have on Elizabethan England, in a bubble, and we're going to use this piece of text at the side to create a mind map of it, okay? Now this is an extract I've taken from the Edexcel GCSE textbook, which you all have a digital copy of now. So if you find it hard reading off a screen, if you find it hard looking at just this little bit, I recommend going to the textbook and having a look at the wider literature as well around it, which is the things we've just gone through and the things we're going to go through in a minute. So first of all, I'm going to read out this extract, and I would like you to take notes from it and put as much as you can into this mind map. Now this is going to be your subject specific knowledge, your specific factual detail, your SFD that we call it in lessons, for if you're asked about the impact of education, okay? So, how big an impact did schools have on Elizabethans? Well, it is estimated that around 30% of men and 10% of women were literate by the end of Elizabeth I's reign in 1603, compared with 20% of men and 10% of women in the 1530s. So the number of people who could read, who could write, who could do basic maths increased by roughly 10% for men, and for women, unfortunately, it didn't change almost at all. This suggests that there was an improvement in education for boys during Elizabethan times, but not for girls. Leading thinkers and writers increasingly believe that women having a good education. I read that again. Leading thinkers and writers increasingly believed in women having a good education. However, they were usually highly educated and well off, and a main obstacle of schooling was its cost. There weren't only fees to consider, but the loss of family income from children not working. This might explain why ordinary people's attitudes to educating their daughters does not seem to have changed in Elizabethan times. Girls were expected to marry, not to work outside the home. Boys were expected to find paid employment and support their wives and children. A little education could help them find a better job. So while education is pushed for boys because they're expected to grow up to become what's called the breadwinner, the earner of the household, to bring in all the money, girls are expected to get married, have children and stay at home. They have no need of an education because it won't come into making the home a nice place for their husband, which, yes, is very sexist, especially considering they have a woman as the Queen of England during this time. Now what I'd like to do next is to write the subheading Education in Universities, because we've looked a lot about schooling during this time, and particularly schools for younger children, but there were universities being built and introduced during this time. Now for those of you not aware, university is a place you go to after you've finished school or college, and it's where you get your degree. It's called higher education. It is a point where you specialise in a particular subject nowadays. At the time, however, England only had 2 universities, and they are probably the most famous 2 universities that we know today. It is Oxford and Cambridge, classed as 2 of the best universities in the country today, and 2 of the oldest. In fact, the 2 oldest in the country. Students would start higher education, though, at universities at this time around the age of 14 or 15 years old, which is different to today when you start it after you finish college at the age of 18 at a minimum. The curriculum included geometry, so the study of shapes, music, astronomy, philosophy, logic, which I know is a subject on its own, and rhetoric. Whereas that is different again to today, where you pick a subject and you specialise in that one subject. So for example, your history teachers specialised in subjects either history or history related. Same for geography, your language teachers, your maths teacher, we all picked one subject to specialise in. Now, Elizabeth did not found Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford was created almost 500 years before Elizabeth in the year 1096, and Cambridge was created 200 years, not 200, roughly 100 years after that in the year 1209. However, what she did was build a number of colleges. So in 1572, Elizabeth founded Jesus College at Oxford for the education of Welsh boys. And she also decided to invest in universities to educate more Protestant clergymen. And if you remember, by clergymen we mean religious people, so people that become vicars and priests and ones who would promote the Protestant religion. So if you think about it, if she's doing more of this to educate more Protestant clergymen, she's going to have more people promoting Protestantism, which is going to make that a more popular and bigger religion than Catholicism in England, which is one of her main problems as Queen. So what I would now like you to do is I would like to draw a straight line with a ruler and put at either side the words completely disagree and completely agree. Now this is what we call a continuum, and you've done loads of these with me before. So what I'd like to do is have a look at the statement at the top of the screen, which reads, "The changed attitudes in the 16th century had a huge impact on education." And in your exam, you could be asked a question like this, and you have got to argue 3 paragraphs and a conclusion, which is 16 marks plus 4 spag marks. Today, what we're going to do is something different. I just want you to tell me your opinion today on this matter. So on your continuum, I would like you to draw a line to show me how far you agree with that statement. Once you've done that, we're going to have a go at a slightly different type of exam question, which you have done before when we studied medicine through time. So once you have finished your continuum, if you go over onto the next slide, you will see that it is a describe two features of Elizabethan describe two features question. Now with these questions, this will be the first question of your Elizabeth questions. You'll have this, one of the 12 markers and one of the 16 markers. So you will see I have done part of it for you. So for feature one, for this question, first it says describe two features of Elizabethan education. So for feature one, I've done it as an I do. So I've given you the example first. Sorry, just ignore that, that's my emails. So I've given you the example. So to get your first mark in this question, you would have to actually just give the feature. So in this case, one feature of Elizabethan education is that very few girls got an education. Full stop. That would be your first tick, that is your first mark in the exam. This is because girls were expected to find a husband and have children, whereas boys were expected to find work. Full stop. That would be your second mark. So for those 2 marks, what you've done is you've given me a feature and you've described it and explained it a little bit further. What I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to ask you to copy out my first feature and label it the teacher example and the I do, because I've done it for you. And then what I would like you to do is to complete this question by doing the second feature. So looking back at what we have studied today, I would like you to write out a second feature and describe it about Elizabethan education. And then once you've done that, and if you've done it 2 sentences like I have done at the start, you should have a 4 mark answer for your GCSE exam.